I'm going to discuss some things that I have hinted at as we have been going along studying languages. Those things are revival and preservation. Revival means literally that. You're taking an extinct language, a language that no longer exists, a language that is dead, and you are going to bring it back from the dead. You're going to attempt to turn it into a living, thriving, spoken, written language. Preservation means that you are going to try and keep a language that is waning alive. Why would a language be waning? Because there are fewer and fewer speakers, largely because bigger languages are absorbing it. The main reason you want to preserve a language that's waning is because people hold language very close to their personhood, and languages are tied to cultures. By preserving the language, you preserve the culture. Let's start with a language that was extinct that has been brought back. Remember, extinct language means that it no longer has any native speakers and is gone. It's not a naturally spoken language. The language I'm going to speak about is Hebrew, because Hebrew has been the most successful of the extinct languages that have been revived. Hebrew was, of course, the language of the Old Testament, or at least parts of it. So we're talking about thousands of years ago, it was a spoken and written language. But in the Middle East, where it was spoken, it was replaced by about the time Christ was around 2,000 years ago by Aramaic. In fact, most people think that Aramaic was the language that Christ actually spoke. At the same time, he still used Hebrew as a language of prayer. Eventually, Aramaic was replaced in the Middle East by Arabic. Now, I will tell you that Aramaic still exists. There are some thousands of people in the western part of Syria that speak Aramaic. And actually, when I lived in Chicago, I met some people from western Syria who spoke Aramaic. Hebrew, though, throughout this entire time, was still used in Jewish prayers, even though it was no longer a spoken language. So it waned and eventually it died off. But it was a written language, which gave it some benefits, and it was still spoken by people using prayers. Of course, the place it was revived was in the state of Israel. You could see the word Israel written on the left-hand side at the top, and then in English, and then you could see the word Israel written in Hebrew. And you can see Israel surrounded by Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and then the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip. Israel was created in 1948. And Hebrew and Arabic are both official languages of the state of Israel. Now, there are some other common languages spoken in Israel. English, because English is the world's language, and in addition to that, there are a lot of American Jews who go to Israel. And Russian, because there's a substantial Russian Jewish population that has immigrated into the state of Israel. Because of the conflicts and wars that surrounded the state of Israel, Hebrew became a source of pride and a national symbol of nationhood. It was incorporated in the education system, and the language has been revived. So they consciously decided to bring this language back because it was a symbol of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. What problems would exist in reviving a language from thousands of years ago today? Now, as I said, it was still spoken because it was used in prayers, but it wasn't spoken in communication. And it was a written language. But of course, the obvious thing is 1,000 years ago, people did not have, for example, a computer or a cell phone. And as a result of that, when you revive a language, oftentimes you have to create new words. And of course, that is exactly what has happened with Hebrew. So lots of new words when you revive a language that has been deceased for a long time have to be created. Now let's take a look at a little bit at preservation efforts. I'm going to look at the Celtic branch of the Indo-European family of languages, but you probably are aware in the Americas, there's a strong attempt to preserve the Amerindian languages that have been slowly whittled away over time down to really just very, very few of these are spoken languages, where there used to be perhaps thousands of them on the two American continents. Those Celtic languages are commonly referred to as Gaelic. However, Specifically, for our purposes, they're going to be Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. All of these are tied to specific national and ethnic groups. They aren't just languages. So you can see that there's a strong reason for the Irish, the Scottish, and the Welsh to preserve their languages. Now, what would be the language that would be absorbing them? That is, of course, obviously English. This is a map of the British Isles. You'll see why this matters momentarily. So this is a photograph of Irish and English. Irish is written on the top, English is written on the bottom. Like the second biggest city in the Republic of Ireland is Cork, which you can see up on the top left-hand side. Cork is the English version of that city, but then you can see the Irish version on the top. This language, of course, is spoken in Ireland, which I've circled there in green. Primarily, it's spoken in Western Ireland. So this area right over here, like Galway and that area right in there, that's where it's spoken. And in fact, what the Irish do is they make sure that in the education system that Irish is taught, and then they take the kids when they're like 10th grade or so, and during the summer, they move them over to Western Ireland, where the language is still spoken natively by probably less than 100,000 people, so that they are acclimated to speaking the language. I went to Mass one time in Western Ireland. The Mass was in its entirety in Irish. Now, being a Catholic, I understood what was going on in the Mass, but I had no idea what was being spoken. I heard people on the phone speaking it. I heard people walking around in town speaking it. It's like, okay, well, that's it. I have no idea what these words are. This is Scottish. You can see that the English is in white down below. The Scottish is in the orange up above, the very famous city Inverness down at the bottom. And then you can see what Inverness is in Scottish. Scotland is the northern 1/3 of the island of Great Britain, which I circled in orange there. This is Welsh, which is a particularly challenging and funky language. You can see both English and Welsh on these signs. It's spoken in Wales, which I circled in orange. And you can see it's that peninsula that sticks out off the western side of the island of Great Britain. How does one preserve a threatened language? How do you do it? Well, you have to do it through education, and you have to get the kids speaking it. Let's face it, because if children are not speaking it, and only old people are speaking it, what's going to happen? The same thing that's going to happen to the old people. The language is going to eventually die off. Therefore, you have to get buy-in from the children through education and get it into their heads while they are still young. If you don't do that, the ability to preserve the language is going to be significantly diminished over time. Another thing you do is you can make it an official language. Irish is indeed an official language in Ireland along with English. Why would people want to put this much effort into it and does it work? Well, it's because language is so closely tied to the personhood of the individual and their culture. But does it work? Boy, it is a tough road to convince young people to learn a language that they can only use in a very, very small area. At the same time, I will tell you this. Sometimes knowing a slightly odd language can be beneficial if you travel, because you get to have a secret language when you travel. This is true. If, for example, you speak Spanish and English, and you're traveling with somebody who speaks both of those languages, and you go to India, and you don't speak any of the languages in the Indian subcontinent. When you speak English, people are going to know what you're saying. But if you speak Spanish, almost nobody there speaks Spanish. You suddenly have a secret language. I remember reading a book about this guy who was going on a surfing safari to the South Pacific, so like Tahiti and these Polynesian islands. And he was from California and Hawaii. And he was going with a friend of his. And his friend said to him, brush up on your Spanish. And he was like, why do I need to brush up on my Spanish? We're going to the South Pacific. And his friend said to him, because that way we have a secret language, because people in the South Pacific don't speak Spanish. Another of these languages that is running through the preservation moment in its life is Basque. Basque is spoken by a few million people in the Western Pyrenees Mountains between Spain and France. It's unrelated to any other language in the world as far as anybody knows. So even though it's spoken in Europe, it is not an Indo-European language. And it may have been the language of Europe prior to the Indo-European invasions, so the people who spoke Indo-European languages, something like 4,000 years ago. Although nobody's completely sure about this, this is in all likelihood what it is. As I said, it's spoken by people natively, the Basques, in the Pyrenees Mountains, in the area around the Pyrenees Mountains, between Spain and France. I'll tell you a little tidbit about California and the Basques. California has the largest Basque population outside of Europe. How do you like that? This is where it's spoken. You can see in the map on the upper left-hand side, you can see it's spoken between Spain and France in the Western Pyrenees Mountains. And then you can see the Basque Autonomous Community and the Basque regions in a bit of France, but mostly in Spain. Now you can see Basque, Spanish, and English on each one of these signs. Let me just take a look at the Basque and see how much of it you can read. Me? None. Okay, this is some Basque here. The child fell in the street. Just take a look at that. Notice that they attach the article to the noun. You see child and the, it gets attached. The man has given the book to the child. Wow. This is some complicated stuff here. Spain is a multinational state, which means that there are groups in Spain who do not feel completely like they are Spanish. The people who live in Catalonia, which is in the northeastern part of Spain, around where Barcelona is at, speak Catalan. It's not Spanish, although it's related to Spanish, and they have an independence movement. The Basques have also had an independence movement. Part of the reason for this is because for a large chunk of the 20th century, the Basques were persecuted. They were not allowed to speak their language or learn it in school. But because of national pride, they have done everything they can to maintain their language. And as a result of that, preserve their culture. Remember, language is a critical component of the personhood of the individual and their culture.